I've been struggling to make this video for a long time. Ever since 5 Laps at Freddy's shot a gigantic hole in the heart of my last Midnight Motorist video, I've known that I needed to make a new one so that I won't have people flocking to the old one and believing something that's not true. The problem is, what is there to even talk about anymore? The common consensus that I brought up in the last video is probably the correct answer, given that Scott went so many years without correcting it.
The theory that most YouTubers gravitate toward is that this minigame follows William after the murder of Charlotte, hence the rain in both minigames. He drives away, stops by a bar, isn't allowed in, goes home, talks to Michael, and discovers that his youngest son was lured to Freddy's by Shadow Freddy.
But then I realized, within the past year or so, the common consensus has actually shifted to a somewhat different narrative. Nowadays, it seems like the majority of people believe that the minigame takes place after the crying child's death, and that it's sort of an origin story for Michael, with either Golden Freddy or Shadow Freddy leading him to the pizzeria to unravel the mysteries of the place. So, with it having been nearly 7 years since we were first introduced to this minigame, I think it's worth a refresher on why we actually got it right from the very start. Let's break this down piece by piece. We've got the Motorist, the time period, Juniors, the Gray Person, the Runaway, the Footprints, that place, and the Mound. That's a lot of stuff for one minigame now that I think about it. This is the easy part. 5 Laps at Freddy's basically confirmed that the Motorist is William. The car has a spring Bonnie antenna topper. The only way they could get less subtle than that is if the phrase William Afton's car was spray painted on the doors. Within the code of 5 Laps at Freddy's, we're told that William is fleeing a crime scene in Midnight Motorist, and we can clearly see that it's raining outside. For some reason, Scott decided to make it so that William committed 2 separate crimes late at night on a day that it was raining. There's the murder of Charlotte, which features rain in the security puppet minigame, and there's the missing children incident, which features rain in the pizza party level of Help Wanted. However, the security puppet minigame gives us a clear visual indication that William sped away in a hurry after he killed Charlotte, given the skid marks on the ground. So I think it's pretty safe to say that Midnight Motorist is taking place after that crime. This is another easy one. The place has a bouncer, and 5 Laps at Freddy's shows us that it's some sort of restaurant. So it would stand to reason that it's a bar, or at least a restaurant with a bar. That also explains why William isn't allowed in. Judging by his atrocious driving, as well as the way that he moves, it seems like he's pretty drunk. And normally I wouldn't use sprite movement as evidence, but this is one of the only sprites Scott has ever made that's legitimate pixel art, so it seems like he was being extra careful with it. If the man with the purple car is William, then I think we can use that same sort of logic to say that the gray person is Michael. Both speak in gray text, both watch TV after midnight, and both show some level of care for their siblings. I mean, sure, he's a massive bully in FNAF 4, but there's a fine line between pulling pranks on your brother and leaving him alone with your abusive drunk father. Plus, Mike looks up to Clara from The Immortal and the Restless, who's constantly arguing with the William stand-in, so it's not like we have any reason to believe Michael is afraid to stand up to his father. If this is William's house, and the gray person is Michael, and the Runaway is a boy, then the Runaway kinda has to be the crying child. A major problem many people have with the idea of the crying child being the Runaway is that it's not in his nature to break a window. And yeah, I agree. I even said as much in my older video. But since then I've realized that this is a total non-issue, because the Runaway isn't the one who broke the window. There's no glass outside, meaning that the glass shattered inward. And based on the laws of physics, that means it was shattered from the outside. That means that the animatronic that was outside of the house broke the window, and either grabbed the kid and ran, or persuaded him to follow. Given the little footprints, the latter option seems much more likely. This also gives relevance to William saying he'll be sorry when he gets back. That wouldn't be there if Michael were to be the runaway. William never does anything bad to Michael, at least in a way that's plot relevant, until sending him to his almost death and sister location, which is way, way after Charlotte's murder. And that wouldn't really fit as a punishment for running away from home with an animatronic anyway. However, it would give context behind William deciding to set up a surveillance system for this one kid specifically, as well as scaring the kid into staying away from the animatronics through the Fredbear plush and possibly even the Nightmare animatronics. If this is happening right after Charlotte's death, then our options for who left the footprints are incredibly limited. In fact, there's literally only one option. The only haunted character with 3 toes that's implied to exist this early on is Shadow Freddy. How do I know he existed already? The answer is actually really simple. It's shown in the opening segment of the very same game that Midnight Motorist comes from. The teasers for Pizzeria Simulator show us that in this minigame, we're playing as the same Freddy from the Take Cake minigame where Charlotte was killed. And during round 3 of the game, Shadow Freddy appears and copies our movements. In a game all about tying up loose ends, this seemingly random inclusion should mean something, especially given that it glitches out when there's only one child left, and on the 4th level, which is the same level that Charlotte dies in the security puppet minigame. And given that Freddy was the only witness to William's first atrocity, it makes sense that the character that embodies said wickedness would take on his form. It's also a form that would help lure in the crying child. Fredbear seemed to be his favorite character, and it's not the only time Shadow Freddy would disguise himself as an animatronic for the purpose of invoking the crying child's connection to Fredbear. It's also not the first time we've seen Shadow Freddy lure someone through the woods to find Charlie. He does the exact same thing in the Twisted Ones. So you can't even argue that it goes against his presumed motive of causing agony. Given that William goes to both Junior's and the site of the Mound, and doesn't find the crying child at either one, that place must be somewhere from outside of this minigame that we'd be familiar with. One place in particular comes to mind: Freddy's. We know the crying child enjoyed going there at some point in his life, as we're told he had a favorite ride from the place. There wouldn't be a point in including that detail in the logbook if we didn't need to know that the kid used to like the place. And remember that the logbook was said to be a tool to help solve the many mysteries of Pizzeria Simulator. Now, with that established, where did Charlotte get killed earlier that night? Freddy's. Or, well, maybe not Freddy Fazbear's Pizza specifically, since it might have been Fredbear's Family Diner, but that's a whole other mystery that, frankly, doesn't matter enough for me to care. Either way, this would mean that the crying child saw Shadow Freddy, the body, and the puppet, thus explaining his fear of the animatronics, especially Fredbear, and his visual connections to the puppet. Here's where I see a lot of people get hung up. It was pretty much established before Pizzeria Simulator came out that the crying child was terrified of the animatronics because he saw something innocent and misinterpreted it. Wouldn't that make this a retcon? Well, yeah. FNAF 4 in general has been completely recontextualized over time. Scott said so himself.
Because, it's for that very reason. It's because, of what I was intending the game to be when it happened, and then after the reaction of it, I was like, I need to craft this into something better for the people who see this as important, and that and that kind of indirectly does change the contents of the box, because it changes the contents of everything that came before.
I do want to make a whole video about the original meaning behind FNAF 4 eventually, but that meaning didn't really matter anymore by the time we were introduced to Midnight Motorist. Alright, I've saved the worst for last. This is the one thing I didn't have a good explanation for in my old theory, and I still don't have a good explanation for it now. It's always this one detail that causes problems, but I do have an okay-ish idea this time around, which is better than last time. At least now I'm not ignoring the fact that the guidebooks call it a grave. My thought process this time was that in order to figure out what the grave is, we need to consider where it is. It's in a clearing in the woods on the side of the road, just off the highway. The road leads to William's house, but the grave is a good distance away from it, so it would stand to reason that whatever is buried in there came from the direction of the highway rather than the direction of the house, since it's so much closer to the highway. If there's one thing the franchise has loved ever since Pizzeria Simulator, it's car accidents. Susie's dog died in a car accident. Pete from Step Closer died in a car accident. Sergio from Sergio's Lucky Day got in a car accident and his girlfriend suffered heavy injuries. Jack and Faraday from Friendly Face died in a car accident, and then Edward died in another car accident in that same story. Joel hit a kid with his car and nearly killed him in Kids at Play. Steve in Help Wanted is tricked into believing he got into a car accident. David died in a car accident in The Mimic. And most importantly, the entire premise of Midnight Motorist is that you're trying not to get into car accidents. So the later that night section is being framed by the idea of car accidents, and then after this minigame came out and confused everyone, we've had the idea of car accidents shoved in our face over and over again for years. If this grave belongs to the victim of a car accident, probably one caused by William, given that, he's the bad guy, it would have to be someone who dies before anyone else in the original storyline. Someone who's been absent for the entire story, perhaps? Someone who we know existed but have never seen? Someone who would be tall enough to warrant such a large mound? Yeah, I think the grave belongs to Mrs. Afton. I'm certainly not the first person to come to this conclusion, but I rarely see anyone bring up the idea anymore. A Reddit post from 2018 by user MichaelO2000 brought up an interesting idea, although a bit of a stretch, that stuck with me through all these years. Back when Gil Keenan was directing the FNAF movie, he tweeted a mysterious image of a teddy bear in a car crash, with the caption, "Only one survived." That tweet was posted all the way back in October 2015, so unless this was just him messing around, the idea of a car crash dates back to way before Pizzeria Simulator. Oh, and one last thing I just remembered while editing. The fan-favorite music track that plays during this minigame is called Smashing Windshields. Like I said, it's not a great answer, but it's kind of all I've got right now. And that's that. Now I can go back to never talking about this minigame again. Until we inevitably get another major hint that upends this entire video.